Welcome to our channel, The Dialectic Order. In today's video, we're going to be looking at what Jordan Peterson means when he uses the concept Postmodern Neo-Marxism. Before I do anything else, I want to quickly explain that this video is intended to be an aid to our written essay, which is titled, What Does Jordan Peterson Mean by Postmodern Neo-Marxism? Other than to encourage a discussion on the topic, the primary purpose of this particular essay is not to take sides. I think it's important for everyone to understand, and that I stress this now, that this is not a critical analysis, and it is not an attempt to attack or defend Jordan Peterson or his ideas. It's simply going to be an explanation of what he means. It's a concept he uses quite a lot and can be confusing, and so we wish to display his argument as clearly and as fairly as possible. In parts, it may sound like we're defending him, but this is because we're trying to explain what he means, and so we'll be referencing both Peterson and Hicks to achieve this. And as they obviously agree with what they're saying, when we're expressing their opinions, this may come across as if we're in complete agreement with them. And so I just want to make this clear now to avoid any confusion. We are not expressing our own views in this video, only those of Jordan Peterson and of Stephen Hicks, who has been a massive influence on Peterson with regards to this subject. We will follow this up with a critical response in the future, in which the aim will be to tease out the concept's strengths and weaknesses. But for now, this is only meant to serve as an introduction to the term, and that's it. So who is Dr. Jordan B. Peterson? You may or may not have already been exposed to him. He has been propelled into fame quite recently. But for those of you who don't know him, I'm going to give you a bit of background information and then we'll move on to the essay. A few key points. He's a Canadian clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. He's the author of two books, one that he released in 1999 called The Maps of Meaning, and another he released earlier this year in January, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Politically, he considers himself a classic British liberal. He's been surrounded by controversy since his rise to fame and has been claimed both as the most important and as the most dangerous intellectual of our time. And a lot of this controversy was probably instigated by an interview that he had on Channel 4 with Cathy Newman. A few things that he's been most critical of are academia or the universities. He's been very critical of political correctness, postmodernism, Marxism, and identity politics in general. He was also a very outspoken critic of Bill C-16, which he saw as a fundamental threat to freedom of speech. And last of all, he's been a very passionate critic of the attack on masculinity. So the steps we're going to take as step one will be a brief description of postmodernism, and step two will be of Marxism. Both of these we're going to use further resources to give you a basic understanding of the concepts that we're going to be grappling with in step three, which is the in-depth description of what Jordan Peterson means with the use of the two terms together. Step one, postmodernism. The key contributors here were Max Horkheimer, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. The postmodern movement was set up as a direct critical response to modernism. It makes the claim that there are a number of faults in the assumptions of the modernists, and so it sets itself up in opposition to them. For example, it rejects the idea of objective reality and truth, and accepts a belief that everything is either subjective or relative. Postmodernists also reject foundationalism, they reject grand narratives, or otherwise known as meta-narratives. They've also made equivalent emotional investigation with rational investigation, seeing no reason as to why one should be valued above the other. And last of all, they are also suspicious of rationality, logic, and reason. They make the claim that what is considered rational or logical or reasonable is dictated by the powerful and then imposed on the weak. Step two, Marxism. Marxism is a political and economic philosophy set up by the philosopher from Germany, Karl Marx. This whole thing focuses on the class conflicts between the bourgeois, who are the capitalists, and the proletariat, who are the working class, the not so rich. It's an in-depth criticism of the capitalist system and its primary use of exploitation as a tool against the working class, who are said to be trapped by a bourgeois system of morality that grounds the existing social order. This existing social order is one that justifies the collection of all the wealth by the few, who are the ones at the top, the bourgeois, the elite, at the expense of the many, who are the working class, who basically earn just enough to survive and are afraid of not accepting such low wages out of fear of starvation. To combat these injustices, Marx aims to introduce a classless society, which is to say that the distinction between rich and poor is dissolved because of the collective ownership to the means of production, and this would stop a few people gathering all the profits, and rather it would then be equally distributed between all those involved in the production itself. This society would also be stateless, which is to say that eventually there would be no rulers and that everyone would have an equal say in how the society is run. And last of all, Marxism predicts that all of this would be the result of a revolution which would be brought about by the proletariat once they became conscious of the exploitation against them. They'd overthrow the rulers and then create a more equal society where everyone's working according to their ability and getting according to their needs. Okay, so now we move on to the juicy bit, which is step 3. And we're going to now discuss the union of the two terms we've been talking about, postmodern neo-Marxism, according to Dr. Peterson, and also we'll be mentioning Stephen Hicks here and there as well. So first of all, the main instigators of postmodernism, they were all committed Marxists until around the mid-1970s. They were always very deeply critical of modern Western society, but by around this point, it was very difficult, especially for an academic intellectual, to justify being a Marxist, as the societies based on that doctrine only ever really produced tremendous misery and bloodshed. The examples Peterson usually gives here is Mao's China or Stalinist Russia. He also makes mention of Cambodia. Now, these problematic societies appeared to have pushed the Marxists into a corner, and so Peterson refers to it as a sleight of hand, but basically what they did is they changed or messed around with Marxist ideals in order to justify holding their philosophical position without really having to give up too much ground. So Stephen Hicks points out two main blows to the Marxist ideology. The two things he references here, first of all, are Khrushchev's revelations on the brutal reality of Stalin's Russia in a speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which is a bit of a mouthful, in February 1956. The second thing that happened was in October, later that same year, which was a bloody suppression of a revolt in the Soviet satellite state of Hungary. These two were fundamentally said to be one of the major motivating factors for this sleight of hand that Peterson refers to.
So what was this sleight of hand? Well, it was the move from a more particular focus on the rich versus the poor narrative, as the Marxists had it, to a more wider focus on anything that can be considered the oppressors versus the oppressed. This is a much more general way of looking at things, and it allowed for the postmodern neo-Marxists to transpose that narrative upon many different kinds of things that could be contained within the identity politics spectrum. For example, special attention was given to women, homosexuals, and ethnic minorities, women being the oppressed by the oppressors, which would be men, homosexuals who were oppressed by heterosexuals, ethnic minorities who were oppressed by ethnic majorities. This move now meant that any characteristic of identity could be splintered off from any group of people who saw themselves as victims or as being oppressed, and this situation could be viewed through a postmodern lens. So the next question here, I guess, is why is that important? Why make the shift from the wealthy versus the poor narrative to a more general concept of the oppressors versus the oppressed? Well, when you take into consideration that within capitalist nations, the living standards were steadily increasing to levels never before witnessed. Starvation was pretty much completely eradicated to the point where people are more likely to die because they eat too much rather than too little, obesity being a major problem. People began getting access to free education for the public. So if you look at today, where in British society, even the poorest of people have access to, for example, the internet or mobile phones. And so as capitalism seemed to be providing above and beyond basic needs, it didn't make sense to try and attack capitalism from this angle anymore. And so you had to think of other ways of doing it, especially considering that communist states in the past have been much more notorious for not being able to provide for basic needs. For example, in the Soviet states, when they began to kill the farmers, which led to massive famine as they were unable to produce enough food to provide for their populace. So it's around here that Peterson starts to point out that due to the industrious nature of capitalism and it bringing more people out of poverty rather than making poverty worse, counter to Marx's predictions, this motivated the shift for the Marxists from a concern for need to equality, because it made no sense to focus on need anymore. It began to make more of an emphasis on making people equal. So the phrase that Marx is famous for saying, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, became a bit problematic for the Marxists because communism wasn't doing so well with needs and capitalism was seeming to be making strides in that area. A good little example of this shift can be seen when you notice that rather than requesting the socialization of private businesses, there was more of an emphasis on requesting that bigger businesses be cut down to size, which is another way of saying use government intervention to reduce the power of those more successful and to make it equal to those that have not been so successful in this area. So not only did they make the shift from need to equality, they also made poverty relative rather than an absolute concept. So although the poor in capitalist Western first world countries weren't as poor as those from third world countries, say in Africa, they were when they were compared to the elites that were living within their society. There's a good little quote here from Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, which gets this point across pretty well. So the proletariat would become revolutionary because while their physical needs were being met, they saw that some others in society had relatively much more than they did, so that being the elites. Feeling excluded and without real opportunities to achieve the good life that the rich were enjoying, the proletariat would experience psychological oppression and thus be driven to desperate measures. So the whole basic needs things, as they were being provided for, they'd become peripheral. They weren't a problem anymore, but there was still this problem with the fact that the rich still had way more, and they were also making much quicker gains. So although the bar had been lifted for the poor, it hadn't been lifted as high or as quickly as it had done for the rich. So poverty became a subjective feeling that expressed itself in the contrast to those who had much more than you. And so even though the poor have much more today than they have done in the past in capitalist countries, none of this mattered, as being compared to those who have much, much more still has a psychological effect and could be considered oppression. A few other points he makes is that postmodern neo-Marxists make the assumption that people understand the world in a way which helps them in attaining more power, something Peterson thinks is a massive oversimplification, because you can't just reduce people to this one particular narrative. There's multiple varying factors that lead to people making decisions in their life and push people in one direction or the other. And to completely neglect everything else and just reduce it down to a power game is an injustice to some degree for Peterson. But following from this, facts are nothing more than a power game which assists the quote-unquote patriarchy in its oppression. So this is kind of why postmodernists are wary or suspicious of facts or the concept of facts itself. They don't see it in the same way that modernists do. They don't see it as this solid, indisputable thing. Facts for them are not genuine expressions of any kind of objective truth. They're only used for this power game in order to push society in a particular direction, which suits those who are already in power. So these points lead to postmodernists refusing in a lot of cases to engage in dialogue with their ideological opponents, because that in some way justifies their position. To engage in discussion is to play the game of the enemy, so to speak, and therefore justify it. With regards to identity, Jordan Peterson claims that the postmodern neo-Marxists have a very particular claim they use here. They say that there is no individual identity and that everyone is an exemplar for the groups that they represent, the group being the fundamental source of your identity. And this plays in part to the distrust that's held towards, say, for example, white cisgendered males, especially if they're trying to combat the rhetoric that's being given by postmodernists. An interesting problem begins to arise here. You may recall at the beginning of the video that I mentioned that grand narratives are rejected by postmodernists. So how then does Peterson claim that they've made a union with a grand narrative, that being Marxism? And also, what's going on here? Postmodernism does appear also to be a grand narrative, arguably the grandest of narratives. So I'm just going to pull up what meta-narrative is on Wikipedia. I'll give you this little description, and you'll probably notice that postmodernism as well could fall under this description. So a meta-narrative, otherwise known as a grand narrative, in critical theory and particularly in postmodernism, is a narrative about narratives of historical meaning, experience or knowledge which offers a society legitimation through the anticipated completion of a as yet unrealised master idea. Now, postmodernism certainly could be described as a master idea that incorporates all other ideas. So how is it then that it can sustain this contradiction? Well, Jordan Peterson would say that they're not really bothered about contradictions. They have already claimed that they are distrusting of concepts such as logic and reason, and they see these as tools of the patriarchy to sustain their current power system. And a contradiction relies on logic and reason. And so if you deny logic and reason, you can deny that there is such thing as a contradiction. So for the postmodernists, there is no problem here. So Peterson says that this is their main tool of defence that they utilise against any kind of attack with regards to their inconsistencies. They openly reject the ideas of objective truth and logic, and so there's no need to be consistent. It's just a rhetorical ploy in order to acquire more power than you had previously. Okay, now it's at this point things become a little bit strange, but also very interesting. And as you recall earlier, I mentioned that the postmodernists, they reject the idea of logic, reason, rationality, but that doesn't mean that they don't make use of it, because they do, especially when it comes to undermining the modernist perspective. And Jordan Peterson and Stephen Hicks, in a conversation they have on Peterson's channel, which I'll post in the description link below, they talk about reasonable objections to the modernist perspective. And they refer to Kant in order to do this. And it goes something as follows. So the foundation of the scientific method completely relies on the assumption that you can derive valid information from sense data, which has been collected from multiple subjects, and that these multiple subjects compare the information that they've all got to determine what is objective. Kant's critique of this is that you can't assume that the data is presented to the subjects that are doing the collecting without a priori structuring in the mind. Now that's quite a mouthful, so I'll try to explain it in as simple as terms as I can. So you've got a number of scientists. Each of these scientists has a brain, and this brain is a biologically evolved structure which has data which is received from the outside world through the senses. Now, before the scientists can even look at something in order to determine what's objective, the information has to go through their brain. And what this means is that as it goes through their brain, before they even have an awareness of the thing they're looking at, it has to be structured. And so they rely on their minds in order to receive data, which then is used in order to create objective information. And the whole point of objective is that this would be the case whether or not you are present, whether or not you as a person are there. But the whole thing relies on the person having received that information, having it being structured by the brain in order to create that. So the objective information relies on a subject. And so here is a massive problem. How do you justify this? So it seems reasonable to ask, how do you know that the outputs of those inbuilt cognitive structural processes have anything to do with the way reality actually is, independent from an observing subject? And so what you end up having is that these points, among many others, are what cause postmodernists to accept a sort of radical scepticism towards modernism. They then completely accept relativism in its place as a solution to this problem. Now, it's not clear that relativism is a necessary conclusion either, and so this is what Jordan Peterson and Hicks then go on to discuss a bit further. But I think that is beyond describing what postmodern neo-Marxism is, so we'll save that for a further video, but you get the point at the meantime. This is what's motivating postmodernist thought. So I've explained so far what postmodern neo-Marxism is according to Jordan Peterson, and I think at this point it's important to stress that Peterson really does think this is a genuine problem and that this ideology is pervasive and it has infected many, specifically humanities professors in the universities, and that these professors are now pushing these ideas onto students in academia, and they've been doing so since the 1960s. Now, Hicks gives a good example of a particular professor who he names as Kate Ellis, who believes, quote, "Sexism is evil, affirmative action is good, capitalism and sexism go hand in hand, and achieving equality between the sexes requires overthrowing the existing order." Now, Peterson sees this particular kind of claim as very problematic because what exactly is meant by overthrowing the existing order? How does that process take place? Overthrowing in what sense? With violent revolution, as Marx predicts, or is it to be undermined in more subtle ways? Stephen Hicks explains this essay in a little bit more detail, where she describes that if there are liberal capitalist students, that these people are considered problematic, and that in some sense they must be converted. So views like equality of opportunity, universal standards of judgment, and beliefs like hard work pays off, these are undermined using Derrida's deconstruction methods, and that this inevitably leaves a void in these liberal capitalists, which is caused by the professors that are teaching them, and then they are quick to fill this void with radical leftist political principles. They basically convert these or turn these students into radical activists in order to push a particular agenda which is formed from postmodernism. One of the problematic principles that Dr. Peterson says the leftist professors are pushing onto their students is the tendency to flatten the concept of power. Now, this is problematic for Peterson for one main reason, and this is that there are a number of subcategories within the concept of power that cannot be considered completely equivalent. So there's two examples I've given here. One, people who are given positions of power because of their own merits as competent and skilled individuals, and who then use that power selflessly to the betterment of the people that gave it to them. If I am really good at carpentry, it's in your interest to give me a higher position in terms of the carpentry world than you if you're not as good as it. So this isn't the same as the second example, where you've got tyrants who violently take power by force against the will of the people and selfishly use that power to their own benefit and also to the detriment of those who are under their control. These are both examples of power, but they're certainly not equivalent, and to conflate them as the same is a massive problem and is something that Peterson thinks the postmodernists do. Here are a couple of quotes which kind of get across the point that discourse is considered something more akin to like a rhetorical battle, and also the lack of care for contradiction, and that language is viewed as this thing which is more of a tool used to win or gain power rather than something that reveals truth. So the first quote is by Foucault, and that is, "Discourses are tactical elements or blocks operating in the field of force relations. There can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy." So there you can see the emphasis on the fact that contradictions don't really matter. The second quote is by Rorty, another contributor towards the postmodern thought. "Conforming to my own precepts, I am not going to offer arguments against the vocabulary I want to replace. Instead, I'm going to make the vocabulary I favour look attractive by showing how it can be used to describe a variety of topics." Again, this is more of an emphasis on not really offering arguments, but rather expressing things in a way that appeals more to emotion rather than to the rational side of an individual. And finally, a quote from Hicks, which kind of sums up what he and Peterson think on the matter. "Postmodernism is subjectivism and relativism in one breath, dogmatic absolutism in the next." So to conclude here, both Peterson and Hicks agree that postmodern neo-Marxists use relativism as a political strategy. Words are nothing more than tools or weapons to be used against an enemy which they wish to undermine, and this plays to the point that they make that postmodern neo-Marxists are not interested in dialogue or discussion, but only to critique, deconstruct, and to set up power games between groups in order to undermine the existing social order. Okay, and that's all we've got time for in this video. So please, if you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. Don't forget to subscribe, as we will be releasing more videos out in the future, going over these concepts in a bit more detail, offering a bit of a critique of this particular one, for example, and also going into a bit more things with regards to philosophy, politics, history. And so if you're interested in that kind of stuff, please keep an eye on our channel. Also, leave a comment, and we would like to start a discussion about this. So we do want to hear what you guys have to say. Check out our website at thedialecticorder.co.uk and have a read through the essay that this video is based on, and respond to us. What do you think of postmodernism? What do you think of neo-Marxism? Do you think it's right to conflate the two as the same? What do you think of Jordan Peterson and the ideas that he puts across? Please comment, subscribe, like, and get involved in the discussion. And we look forward to talking with you guys in the future. But other than that, thank you for your time. I hope you have a nice day, and see you again. Bye.